Napoleon didn't really shoot cannons at Egypt's pyramids. But scholars say that a trailer for Ridley Scott's new film draws attention to the French emperor's complex and lasting legacy on the study of Egypt's cultural heritage. As Ridley Scott's Napoleon opens for Thanksgiving holiday viewing, scenes from the film's trailers are making waves. That was especially true of a sensational depiction of French troops led by Joaquin Phoenix as the French emperor firing cannons at the pyramids of Giza. "I don't know if he did that, Mr. Scott told the Times of London. But it was a fast way of saying he took Egypt." There is no evidence that French invaders launched artillery at the pyramids or that Napoleon's troops shot the nose off the Sphinx. Another piece of popular apocrypha evidence suggests that the nose was chiseled off centuries before Napoleon's time. From what we know, Napoleon held the Sphinx and the pyramids in high esteem and used them as a means of urging his troops to greater glory, said Salim Akram, a professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo. He definitely did not take pot shots at them. While creative license is expected in Hollywood biopics, Mr. Scott's cinematic choices prompted memes, discussion and light-hearted dunking, including riffs about Napoleon battling mummies. Some historians have criticized Mr. Scott, but many hope Napoleon will generate interest in the events that inspired the film. And while Napoleon didn't literally hurl projectiles at the pyramids, his invasion of Egypt had a profound effect on Egyptian cultural heritage and how the world understands it today. Ultimately, the campaign is a defeat. The French lose and get kicked out, said Alexander McCabreds, a professor at Louisiana State University in Shreveport who specializes in Napoleonic history. But Napoleon's invasion also resulted in a complex scientific and cultural legacy, he added. The beginning of Egyptology, the beginning of this fascination with Egypt and the desire to explore Egyptian history and Egyptian culture. The French campaign in Egypt from 1798 to 1801 was driven by Napoleon's colonial ambitions and a desire to stymie British influence. But in addition to amassing an army of some 50,000 men, Napoleon made the unusual decision to invite more than 160 scholars in fields like botany, geology, the humanities and others to accompany the invasion. The scholars documented the cultural and natural landscapes of Egypt, which they eventually compiled into a seminal 1809 publication that contained detailed entries about the Giza pyramid complex. This is one reason historians know that Napoleon visited the pyramids, as shown in Mr. Scott's film, though it is unlikely he regarded the structures as military targets. There was a real interest on the part of the scholars and, I think by extension, a real interest by Napoleon to be able to understand these things that Europeans hadn't really had unfettered access to since the classical period, said Andrew Bednarski, a visiting scholar at the American University in Cairo who specializes in Egyptology and 19th century history. In their effort to document Egypt's vast archaeological heritage, the French scholars seized many important artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone, a rock inscribed with 3 languages that proved instrumental in deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. The stone and many other spoils ended up in British hands after the French hold on Egypt collapsed in 1801. By then, Napoleon had returned to France. Following the failed campaign, word of Egypt's cultural wonders spread across Europe and powered a new wave of global Egyptomania. This insatiable appetite for Egyptian antiquities has resulted in centuries of exploration, excavation and exploitation of the region's vast material culture. Since Napoleon's invasion, countless artifacts have been removed from Egypt by prospectors and traders, many through clandestine and outright criminal channels. Did Napoleon really fire at the pyramids? A historian explains the truth behind the legends of Ridley Scott's biopic. Directors of historical feature films face a difficult task. How can they make the characters familiar to an audience without reducing them to caricature? How can they make sure that knowledge of the outcome, battles won or lost, empires built then ruined, doesn't make the story seem like it's writing itself? Director Ridley Scott is not a historian and presumably wants to entertain rather than to enlighten. But the problem of historical truth is an interesting one. It is not easy to know the real Napoleon. There's a recognizable version of him, the confident general beloved of his troops, the instinctive military tactician who could run on empty for days at a time, his stern and somewhat petulant gaze. But much of this is the product of layers of historical storytelling, accrued by the labor of generations of artists, journalists and memoirists, and of course, Napoleon himself. Abel Gance's spectacular silent film Napoleon, 1927, for example, charted the life and career of Napoleon up to his departure as a military general for the Italian campaign in 1796. In one scene, a heavy winter snowfall interrupts classes at Napoleon's military college. The boys run outside to play and inevitably start throwing snowballs at each other. The scene depicts a very young Napoleon emerging as a natural commander, directing the combat as though on the field of battle. Yet the veracity of this moment rests primarily on a single account, the memoir of one of Napoleon's childhood friends, Louis de Bourrienne, who attended the same school. The author was later an employee of Napoleon, who sacked him for embezzlement in 1802. Many years later, in 1829, de Bourrienne penned a memoir in the hope of cashing in on the popular appetite for authentic tales of the great general. What we think we know about the real Napoleon is often filtered through self-interested and partial accounts like this one. Here are the facts and legends behind some of the major scenes from Ridley Scott's new Napoleon biopic. Did Napoleon crown himself? Napoleon went to great lengths to craft his image as a benign ruler and man of the people, often enlisting the talents of artists to do so. Most notoriously, Jacques-Louis David was commissioned to produce a series of grand paintings depicting Napoleon's coronation in Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris in December 1804. In the most famous, we see Napoleon place a crown on the head of the new Empress Josephine while a reluctant Pope Pius V looks on. In an astonishing act of hubris, Napoleon had indeed already placed a crown on his own head, though the oil painting shows him only in laurel leaves to signify his martial triumphs. What Scott's film depicts is the magnificence of the oil paintings, which showed Napoleon and his empress in the most flattering light, rather than the coronation ceremony itself. His relationship with Josephine. There is no doubt that Napoleon felt a deep passion for Marie-Joséphine Rose de la Pagerie, known to him as Josephine, whom he married in 1796 as his military career was in the ascendant. Yet her depiction in Ridley Scott's film as a young seductress probably speaks more to sexist cliché than to Josephine's undoubted self-assuredness. She was 6 years older than Napoleon, a widow and mother of 2 young children when they met, and the young general's romantic feelings were seemingly stronger than hers. While on campaign he wrote to her virtually every day, his pen sometimes piercing the parchment, such was the force of his emotions. Yet some of these letters to her remained unopened. Their relationship was as tumultuous as it was passionate, and both spouses had several affairs. Yet when Napoleon instigated divorce in 1809 for want of an heir, it was surprisingly amicable. The Empress retained her imperial title until her death in 1814 and was permitted to continue living in the imperial Château de Malmaison. Was Napoleon present at the execution of Marie Antoinette? The autumn of 1793 was especially busy for Napoleon given his increasingly important role in the siege of Toulon. Federalist rebels had handed over the French fleet to the British Admiral Samuel Hood, and the young artillery officer commanded the operation that eventually seized it back. Therefore it is highly unlikely that he ventured to Paris in October to be among the crowd that witnessed the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette. In a letter to his older brother Joseph, however, Napoleon did claim to witness the storming of the Tuileries Palace by an angry crowd of Republican protesters in June 1792. It revolted him. Napoleon began his Egyptian campaign in 1798. The cultural legacy of the campaign can be seen in the well-stocked Egyptology section of the Louvre. But it was also the scene of atrocities. At one point, several thousand Ottoman soldiers were shot or driven into the sea on Napoleon's orders, rather than taken prisoner. You don't need to invent ice traps or Napoleon ordering his men to fire at the pyramids, as Ridley Scott's biopic does, to convey his callous disregard for life. It was the rumor that he had ordered his own plague-stricken troops to be poisoned in the town of Jaffa that finally tarnished Napoleon's reputation in the early 19th century. It stuck no matter how brilliant the sanitizing riposte of the artist Antoine Jean Gros, whom Napoleon commissioned in 1804 to paint a different story. Ridley Scott's film does not represent the past so much as carry versions of the tales and images depicting Napoleon that have spun him into existence since his own lifetime, many of which were crafted by his own hand. There are millions of people who are working to find solutions to our biggest problems. In our weekly email, which I help curate, you will get a